Right.
I did hear at a meeting is nonprofits don't like timeshares, so don't give timeshares. Apparently they're a pain to manage and
Actually,
expensive and all the things.
actually, that is one thing I agree with. That's the one asset I would say avoid at all costs because when you look at timeshares and you look at how many years people have been trying to sell these things, it's literally 2 years, 3 years. So I would say that one is a hard no.
Yeah,
That's when
yeah.
I would say don't put that in your gift acceptance policy.
There was an attorney that did a presentation on charitable planning, and she said, "Say no to timeshares. No timeshares will be
Yeah,
taken here because it's just too
I
much of a mess."
I agree with that 100%.
Yeah.
Welcome to Planning Reimagined, a podcast from the planning experts at Robin Glenn and RX Investment Partners for wealthy families and successful business owners.
In a world where every dollar counts, how can we make sure that our charitable giving is also truly impactful? Well, whether you're just beginning in your philanthropic journey or you're a seasoned donor, today's episode is packed with valuable insights. We'll be discussing both traditional and innovative strategies to help you maximize your charitable impact. Welcome back to Planning Reimagined, where your wealth journey meets our expert insights. I'm your host, Celeste Moya, and today we're going to be discussing strategic philanthropy. Joining me today is Rick Peck and Chris Stiegel. Welcome, both of you. Rick, better known as the philanthropy guy, which I love that, by the way, that you've been able to coin that name and the website, which is phenomenal. Rick is an independent philanthropy advisor, and he brings almost 2 decades of experience in aligning donors' passions with impactful giving strategies. And Chris is an advanced planning expert that specializes in all kinds of innovative solutions across many planning facets, including philanthropy goals. And he's also my colleague at Robin Glenn. So thank you so much both for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Celeste.
Well, let's get started. So, Rick, we're going to start with you. I'm just going to call you philanthropy guy going forward. Just kidding. So, Rick,
Okay.
there are many ways to give back, right, to our favorite causes. We all have things that are near and dear to our heart. But let's just start for our audience that maybe just thinks of donations as I'm just going to go give cash somewhere. Can you start with a high-level overview of some of the different methods used for charitable giving?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I usually try to frame it like this, sort of like what you just did. I start with 4 ways that people can give. I say you can give from your checkbook, which is what most people do. So they write a check out of their checkbook or their savings account, or they make a credit card donation. And that's a very common way, a cash donation, especially coming up in December, for example, when it's a very popular time of year to give. But then there's also a second way is a commercial donor advised fund. So you could go to Fidelity or Schwab, which is now known as DAF Giving 360, or you could go to Vanguard or some other institution and set up a commercial donor advised fund at a very low cost, usually a really small point of entry, maybe even $0 to get in, have a widely diverse group of choices as far as investments, and then make grant recommendations. So you don't have to write a check to 15 different institutions at the end of the year. You can make grant recommendations and have the commercial donor advised fund sponsor move those dollars out. Or number 3, you could go to a community foundation, which is where I used to work. And you could go there and say, we could set up a donor advised fund, or we could set up 5 other different types of funds. We could set up field of interest funds or restricted funds or scholarship funds or what have you, and get really personalized service. Maybe the fees are a little higher. Maybe there's more to it as far as getting involved. It's not sort of self-directed, but it's more something where people can spend a little bit more time getting to know the field officers and the senior program officers and such. But it's more of a, how do I get to know the ground? How do I get to know the local community? And then the 4th is a private foundation. So a private foundation for people who say, I have more money. Maybe I want to employ a family member. Maybe we want to brand ourselves in a certain way, or maybe we've just always wanted a family foundation. So we can set those up. And the most important thing is people can do all 4, and people do. They sometimes write checks out of their checkbook. They have a commercial donor advised fund. They work with a community foundation, and they have a private foundation.
Yeah, so that's, it's so great to see how far along philanthropy has come as far as the options that are available. There's really nothing stopping folks from being able to be philanthropic and charitable And one of the things I hear often, I know we're going to talk about some misconceptions, is I don't have enough money to be a donor, right? But there's so many ways to do it. And even it's been simplified with the DAFs, and we're going to expand a little bit later on what that all means. But there's so many different ways to do it. And so,
Yeah.
so Chris, obviously giving is, we do it because we support a cause, because of personal fulfillment, because we want to be good humans, right? We want to take care of the world. But what are some of the other benefits, things that we kind of probably focus on a little bit more at Rob and Glenn when it comes to being charitable, the other benefits of being charitable?
The other charitable, the other benefits for sure. I'll get to the big benefit here in a second, but yeah, I mean, there is a lot of personal fulfillment whenever you are making donations to charities or causes that matter to you. But there's also some really intended probably consequences of doing that as well. And one of those is at least certainly for me and a lot of the families we work with is getting your kids involved as well, and seeing them sort of seeing how you're utilizing your money to a better benefit, to the greater good, if you will. And so when kids see that and they can participate in it in a lot of ways, if it's not financially, maybe it's just time, but even if it is monetarily, and they can witness it, it can change their perception on the world and how money can be utilized. And again, sort of the impact that somebody at an individual level can really have on a community. I also think another one that's really interesting that's often overlooked is that if you're giving on a regular basis, or you're giving substantial amounts, you're going to make connections to people you wouldn't normally make connections to. Those folks that are working inside, the managing the DAFs, or if they're doing a foundation, or you're getting involved in a local charity, you're going to meet a lot of people and a lot of like-minded people. And so, being able to use those dollars, not just for the greater good, but also to sort of meet some like-minded folks can go a long ways too in other aspects of your life. So it just helps build out a broader network for, again, those like-minded people. And then here's the big one, and this is the one you're probably getting to. Ethics. If you donate, you can get income tax deductions. And if you donate at passing, well, guess what? Those aren't subject to estate taxes. So that's sort of the big, it's like hanging over my head every time I start talking about charitable planning. It's like, look at all these good things that we can do, and look at all the impact you make on the community. Oh yeah, also you're going to get nice big tax deduction too. That's pretty awesome. It's kind of a win-win.
Yeah, and for the sake of transparency, we have a lot of clients that, are still good people, but many times they need that charitable, tax deduction because their estate is so big, income is high, and they, of course, to a certain extent do it because they support a cause, but it also does have significant tax benefits when it comes to estate planning, tax planning, business planning even, right? So there is that big benefit there.
Yeah. I like to call those people the, when they're ready to do that, they're like, oh, I want to do, a big deferral on income taxes. I know we're going to get down into some of the nuts and bolts of how some of these things work. But sometimes you have accidental philanthropists who are like, oh, I like this structure and this works for me. I just got to go pick a charity now?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. When they're like, well, I'm not charitable. And we're like, well, you're going to get, this much back. And they're like, well, I'm all of a sudden real charitable. So things change real quick. So Rick,
I think that's a cool thing though, because when we do run into those situations, and Rick, I know you probably see this a lot. When people are trying to find charities to give to, a lot of times they'll look, internal and say, oh, well, maybe my kid or one of my cousins or maybe my parent has some sort of an issue, so I'm going to donate to that kind of cause, and all of a sudden their brain sort of shifts a little bit in how they can utilize their money. Have you had situations where you're like, oh yeah, let me help you kind of find the right kind of spot for you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, sometimes it starts with this. Instead of saying, let's just go right to a charity, it starts with, who are you? What do you stand for? What are your values? What are the issues that you care about? Just start there. And then after that, we start to expand out into, oh, well, here's some nonprofits you could choose, or here's some nonprofits your family can choose. Because what you're talking about does happen. It's like, oh, well, I should learn more about that charity. But sometimes it just is more stepping back saying, well, you could, or maybe you just should stop and look at yourself and say, I've never maybe in my life stopped and thought, what kind of impact am I looking to make? And maybe this is a chance to do that.
And there's so many organizations we don't even know about. So like I'm in Dallas, Texas, and we have something called North Texas Giving Day. And when you go into the system, to the online website, you realize, and you put, I don't know, education. and 40 organizations will come up that you've never heard of before. So having some guidance on, well, what do you stand for? What do you mean? That can kind of help narrow it down to, okay, there might be something you don't even know exists out there that you want to get involved with or support.
That's exactly right. There's so many choices. I mean, technically, there's about 1.8 million, almost 2 million
Wow.
nonprofits out there. So to say, where am I going to narrow down is critical. You have to narrow down. There's no possible way that anyone could donate to everybody, nor should they. They should stop and say, what's important to me? And then, as you just said, Celeste, just find out what the right nonprofits are for my particular focus.
Yeah. And so with so many options, not just on the organization wise, but with like the different methods that you shared with us, Rick, how do you help your donors choose the right giving method?
I think it always starts with, what are you trying to accomplish? Sometimes people come and they'll say, I think I want to do this. And then, or they've heard about it. You know, it's kind of classic advertising. I heard about this, so I think I should do it. I usually step back and say, well, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? Tell me about your giving habits. Tell me about, back to what we just said, what are you trying to accomplish? Who are you? What kind of research have you done so far? Or if anything, because otherwise they're just going to go barreling down a certain road, and to what end? So I usually just say, do you write a lot of checks out of your checkbook? Are you looking for an easier way? Are you looking for help? For example, some people who have had commercial donor advisements for a while, they're in their 60s or their 70s and say, you know, there's nothing wrong with this particular commercial DAF. I've enjoyed it. It's been fine, but I'm in a time in my life where I need a little bit more one-on-one. I need to know if what I'm doing is actually making an impact. I need to have a conversation with some experts around it. So then when they have those conversations, it leads them maybe to a community foundation instead of the traditional method that they've always chosen, which is a commercial DAF. And then around private foundations, a lot of times we'll talk to families about, well, is it a private foundation that you want, or is it a donor advised one that you want? Let's look at both of these side by side. You might get a better tax break with the donor advised fund. You might have more flexibility with the donor advised fund. Or there might be some things you want to do around, again, hiring your family, as I mentioned before, that a donor advised fund won't allow. So maybe the private foundation is better for you. So you literally go down line by line by line with somebody and say, it seems like you're leaning more toward this. But as I mentioned earlier, sometimes you just say, maybe you have more than one right giving method, depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So it's really just comes back down to a conversation with people to say, before we go barreling down the road of this or that, let's just stop and say, what do you do? What are your habits? What do you think your habits are going to be? What do you think you're going to want to do? And let's choose the right giving vehicle.
Yeah, we've had actually this year several families that Chris and I have worked with where they come to us first and they say, oh, I need a private foundation because my friend at the country club or whatever said I needed it. And then when we kind of peel back the layers, it's like, well, that's not really what you need. We talk a lot about we need to start with objectives all the time, regardless of what planning we're doing. If we understand your objectives, overall goals, and what you have, like the means to achieve the goals, then we can give you some direction. So absolutely, starting with that objective in mind is so important. So that's maybe, sometimes these are more seasoned donors that have been giving money for several years. What about for the newer ones? Like, what are some of the, I guess, issues or common misconceptions that you see with some of these newer donors that are just starting in the philanthropy journey?
Well, I'd say some misconceptions are maybe they think they're going to be able to make more impact than they will actually be able to make. Maybe they think that the progress is going to happen more quickly. So they have false expectations about what their money can do. I would also say common misconceptions, when I say this, I'm thinking about scholarship, about the fact that they have to put a lot of guardrails on something. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. One individual, he came forward and he said, well, I'm doing some research on behalf of this entity that I'm doing some fiduciary work for, and we want to set up a scholarship fund at the time it was Dartmouth Medical School. And we think that the scholars should always have a 3.5, I think is what they said, at least. And so we got the dean of admissions on the phone, and he started talking. He goes, I just want to let you know there's about 80 people who are at the medical school at any given time as far as a new class. They're all 4.0. Okay, so you don't even need to put the 3.5. It's so competitive that they probably have more than a 4.0. So what it was is it was a conversation between, instead of the donor sort of saying, it's going to be like this, it was a conversation with the ones who are closest to the work to say, this is actually what we really need. If you're going to set up a scholarship, let's talk about it. It should probably be more manifested like X. And that was a nice conversation because it was like we respected each other, but it was just a matter of misconception. Like they thought that they had to be more directive than they had to be as new donors. And the other side, the ones who are receiving the money, say, you don't have to worry about it. We thought about this stuff all the time. In fact, let's go in a slightly different direction. So I'd say it's a lot of it is people coming with misconceptions or ideas around how things should be, and you get the experts to come in and very carefully and gently say, how about thinking of it this way? And maybe one last thing, the people also thinking that they don't want to do unrestricted giving. They said unrestricted giving is a bad idea. Who wants to pay for operating expenses? I don't know where my money's going. And so the misconception is somehow it's being poorly spent if it's not restricted. And the idea is not necessarily. Okay, so look at what they're doing. They do need to keep the lights on, keep the heat on, and run their general operations. Not everything has to be a restricted gift. So that's a misconception that somehow it's blown away, or it's misdirected, or it's poorly used, and it's not true at all. It just means that you're giving it to the highest priorities of the institution for them to use. So I'd say those are some common misconceptions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's even like watchdogs built around that exact topic, right? So understanding, every single dollar can't go to, that particular cause. You're right. They have to keep the lights on. So there's definitely some other organizations, some of them charities too, right? That help sort of govern how well an operation is running, how well a charity is running, right?
Right. Yeah, of course. There's lots of institutions that are looking at parameters around what are the criteria that are important. Sometimes it's really basic criteria, and sometimes it's much more in depth. I think it just goes back to what is it as a donor that you're looking for? What's important to you? And some things might not be important to you other than just good fiscal responsibility. As long as they're fiscally responsible, I don't care what they do with it. Others say, I have 17 different criteria I need the nonprofit to fall into. And if they fit those criteria, I will make a very large gift to them. So it just depends on the expectations of the individual making the gift and what they feel impact looks like as unrestricted or as very hyper focused as that might look like.
Another thing I've seen as far as like misconceptions or I guess issues that we come across is where a grandparent or parent says, I want to set it up this private foundation and we're only going to help this type of organization. We're going to focus on this cause. And my family's always going to want to do this. And then 3-4 generations come down and they're like, we have no interest in, I don't know, gardening or something, right? So it's having some flexibility to, especially when you're setting up some of this legacy type of charitable planning, because future generations' interests change quite differently. My daughter the other day said she wanted to be an influencer. And at first I didn't even think she knew what that was. But, 20 years ago, you said influencer, you would have been like, I don't even understand what you're talking about, right? So I just think generations change so much that we have to build in some flexibility in that legacy planning to to your point of not making it so stringent.
Right.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. We to your point, we don't know what the economy is going to look like or education is going to look like or what the problems are going to be, either in the U.S. or globally for that matter in 20 or 40 years. To your very point, the world is going to look wildly different. So yeah, I think if somebody's comfortable with less guardrails and more flexibility, I mean, it's key for the longevity of that intended gift, especially if you're planning for that to benefit for well beyond your passing.
And so before we jump into some, specific giving vehicles, Chris, I think we've kind of touched on it a little bit or alluded to, but why is it so important that when you are, serious about creating a plan, a charitable plan or being philanthropic, that you engage professionals like Rick to be able to guide you through the process?
Yeah, no, I honestly, I think Rick hit it on the head there just a moment ago. It's really just making sure that what your intentions are line up with what your philanthropic goals are, as well as your personal goals for, your finances or your family. Because once you kind of get those 2 or 3 boxes checked, the structure is going to become the structure, right? Whether it's a DAF or we're going to talk about CLTs and private foundations and all that other stuff here in a minute. But if you can get those things figured out first, then the more technical discussions about, the actual vehicle to give And then, the planner ecosystem around that, your attorneys and CPAs and folks like Rick and Rob and Glenn they'll just help guide you through it. So it is really important, but I agree with Rick. It's really about just making sure that your goals and your wants are laid out prior to actually giving or trying to set up a structure.
Yeah, and they can help you also fit it into your overall financial legacy estate plan, right? Because that's an important component of it too. It has to fit in. You can't say, I'm going to give away $1 million and then all of a sudden, inheritances are impacted and your children are mad at you. So you have to make sure it all aligns properly. So let's talk about some specific giving strategies. So Rick, one that you already mentioned, donor advised fund. I don't know if all of the United States, but here in Dallas, very much a hot topic. Both the community foundation space and other organizations are consistently talking about it. But for our audience that doesn't know what that is, we frequently call them DAFs. Can you explain what a DAF is, the advantages, and the potential drawbacks of using them as well?
Sure. They've been around a long time, which makes it so interesting how popular they're becoming, especially in the past few years. So I'd say around turn of the century, 2000, you started seeing the commercial donor advised funds really lean into this space, but the community foundations have been in this space for a long time. They kind of owned that market, but the commercial DAFs have taken it and really taken off and really taken it to another level. But just for level setting for the audience, about $250 billion are in donor advised funds as of this recording.
Wow.
And only growing. And not that long ago, it just crossed into the million mark as far as how many people had donor advised funds. And now it's close to 2 million people and more that have donor advised funds. So, and I think what's really interesting about DAFs is they do get a lot of criticism these days, but on average, they pay out more than 20% of their total assets each and every year on average, which means some people don't pay anything out of their donor advised funds. So they probably should, but maybe they're holding it for something else. And then others pay 100% out. It's like a complete pass through and everything in between. So they're very hot. And I think it makes sense why they're hot, because some call it like a way to use a charitable checkbook. You just put all your money into this checkbook and you disperse your grants out. You let the donor advised fund sponsor do the heavy lifting. You just have to place your order basically. And if your request is granted, which is why it's called a donor advised fund, you don't actually have full control over that. The sponsor technically gets to decide whether or not that money goes out the door. But most of the time, if it fits the criteria of being a 501c3 or whatever, what have you, the donor advised fund sponsor will release those dollars as a grant. But I think that what makes them controversial is those people who don't put anything out, because with donor advised funds, you don't have to take a mandatory distribution out of it like you do with private foundations. Private foundations have to distribute at least 5% each and every year. Donor advised funds don't. So you're kind of on the honor system there, hoping that people do that. And like I said, most of the time you do see it in the numbers where people do it. But a lot of times it just gets hyper-focused on those who don't produce those distributions. Maybe the last thing I'll say about DAFs is they are very good for receiving non-cash asset donations. So if people have real estate or closely held stock or publicly traded securities or other types of assets that aren't easily donated to a charity, for example, maybe the charity says, it's not in our policy to receive those dollars in that form. Maybe people say, well, that's fine. I'll just put it into my donor advised fund, let Fidelity take care of it or the community foundation take care of it. They'll liquidate the money and then they'll put it into a diversified portfolio of investments. And then that'll be invested until the person decides they want to make that grant distribution. So that's what I'd say the pros and the cons are. But I think there's more pros than cons to DAFs. And I think we should always keep that in mind when we see the criticisms. It's like, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yes. And I just recently learned about the tangible, like the asset part of it. I was at a meeting. We have the Dallas State Planning Council here, and there was a representative from the Communities Foundation of Texas. It was a whole panel on different things, and they were talking about, we accept art that we can, put into these donor advised funds, other tangible collections, like collector's items. There was a collector that had, I forgot what they're called, but when you're out hunting and you call the animals, with the little whistles or whatever.
Duck call.
Yes, a duck call. A huge collection of that was hard to do much with, but they were able to put it in this donor advised advice fund. So, it was
No.
interesting to hear the flexibility that they provide. I didn't know that that was an option within them.
Yeah, I mean, most people don't realize that I think it's 90 to 95% of Americans' assets are in non-cash positions, and yet a lot of nonprofits solicit solely for cash gifts. And so I'm out there all the time just saying, don't do that. Stop asking for cash only, ask for other assets. And by the way, if you just still can't get your head around it, or your board doesn't want to do it, or it seems complicated, you can either get a third party to help you, or you can put it into your donor advice fund.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but also another benefit of the DAF is that you can say, I support LGBTQ, or I'm sorry if I'm saying if I said it wrong, but and then the group, the community foundation, can go in and say, okay, well, here are 20 of the organizations that meet your parameters, and now we're going to help you distribute the funds to all of them without you having to go in and select specific organizations if you're not sure about who to give to.
Yeah, that's the beauty of a community foundation. As you say, I'm interested in food scarcity. I'm interested in the unhoused. I'm interested in climate. I'm interested in behavioral health. I'm interested in pick your topic. And usually the community foundation will go deep on that topic if they haven't already done so, because usually they have their ear to the ground all the time on that topic. And they'll come back and say, this is who we think you should consider. And then you have a dialogue. And sometimes donors say, well, can you go a little deeper on that one particular group? Or maybe they make a grant to them and then they learn a little bit more about them. And then a year later they say, I think I want to give them more. I really love what they're doing. So it becomes an iterative type of back and forth dialogue that you're having for those who want to keep learning and keep doing more and more in that way. One other thing I'll mention around donor advice funds is you can make those anonymous. You can also say, I don't want the nonprofit to know that it's me because I don't want to be solicited, or whatever their reasoning is. So they'll just say, we're the Green Tree Fund, and you'll never know it's tied to our family. And they'll just make grants out of that. And sometimes donors do that for a reason, and nonprofits don't really like it very much sometimes because they want to say thank you. But such as it is, that's how you can use a donor advice fund.
Funny you say that. I actually just came across that situation about a month ago. And yeah, from a public perception, they did not want anybody to know that they were giving to those particular causes. So it was an interesting exercise to one, understand why, which is fine. Everybody's got their reasons. And then two, the setup via a DAF to get where they needed to go and making sure it was all anonymous. It was actually pretty cool.
Yeah, I have a quick story on the anonymity. When I was working at Dartmouth College, I met a gentleman. He was class of 58. And I got to know him pretty well. And I called his home because he asked me to. His wife picked up and she was kind of like, who's this? And I said, Bob told me to call. And she goes, okay. And she hands the phone to Bob. And I said, Bob, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset your wife. What's going on? And he goes, Rick, this is our back line. We have a front line. We get 100 phone calls a day from nonprofits, 100. He said, that's why we give anonymously, and that's why we have this backline. So when you got the backline, she was very apprehensive, and she doesn't know you. And I said, okay, and so I remembered that because I just thought it isn't just about ego or who knows why people think other people give anonymously. Sometimes it's just trying to protect themselves from being bombarded with everybody under the sun when they're not that strategically interested in 95% of the charities that are reaching out to them. But how do they protect themselves? So anyway, I learned how to understand that situation a little bit better.
Makes
Yeah,
perfect
sort of like
sense.
you, Celeste, right? As a Baylor alum, and you start giving the University of Texas, you don't want anybody to know that, right?
Never, just so you know, I would never do that. Nobody believed that because that is not true. When I lived in Austin, I didn't even wear burnt orange. I'm sorry, no offense to UT, but I just couldn't do it. That would be terrible. But yes, we have a lot of families that want to be anonymous for that reason because they just, they're wealthy, and so people just assume like, oh, well, you want to be charitable, right? But maybe not to you. And so,
Right.
that makes perfect sense. So, Chris, another, I would say, strategy or giving vehicle that kind of comes and goes in popularity are charitable trusts. I feel like I know a partner that I had before in business, he mentioned in the 80s, everybody wanted to talk about charitable remainder trust, or CRTs as they're called. And then I feel like those have come back a lot recently too, and we talk about them with our clients. So can you talk about charitable remainder trust, or CRTs, charitable lead trusts, CLTs, and kind of how they work, how they differ, and why they're beneficial?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that, as kind of mentioned before, I think the one of the big reasons that people are going to use a CLT or a charitable lead trust or a charitable remainder trust is going to be that income tax benefit up front. They're going to take their assets that have highly appreciated, they're going to put it into one of those two trusts, and then that trust is going to sell it and do all of its stuff. So that basically enables, again, the donor to get a pretty hefty income tax deduction on that donation going into those trusts. They are different, though, in that they are opposite and who they benefit first and second. So if you give assets to a charitable remainder trust, that means that whatever is left inside of the trust is going to go to the charity, which means something's got to happen in that trust for there to be a remainder. And that's what that, the CRT, there's an A in there for an annuity. And so what happens is if you give to a charitable remainder annuity trust, you're going to donate assets to it. It's going to sell stuff. The trust doesn't have to pay any income taxes on what it sells because it's a charitable trust. And it's going to pay you an annuity back, or who you choose, an annuity stream. And so that's kind of cool, right? So you donate, you're going to get money back. You paid over time, probably at least as much as you put into it. And then whatever's left inside of that bucket is going to go to the charity that you chose to set up with the trust. So it's a cool way to create income for you, and income tax deduction for you, but then also give it to the charity on the back end. And now that was a charitable lead. No, yeah. And now you have a charitable lead trust, which is sort of the opposite of that, about who benefits first and who benefits second. So a charitable lead trust, that annuity, still an annuity, is going to be paid to the charity during your life. And then whatever is left is going to go to, say, your kids. And so that's just a cool way to kind of flip it on its head. So if you want to give and you want that deduction up front, but you also want to see your dollars at work while you're living, then that lead trust is probably a really good choice for you, because you're going to see those dollars going straight to those charities. And then whatever's left is going to go to the kids, of course, estate tax-free, which is always a nice thing to say there as well. So they are really cool trusts. They do provide a lot of benefits. We see a lot of it right now, and why we're seeing quite a bit of Rob & Glenn, I think, in the M&A world. If you looked at quarter to quarter this year versus last year, going up through Q2, I think M&A was up 21%. Seeing a lot of businesses being transacted, being purchased and sold. And so what we'll do a lot of times is, prior to that transaction, prior to
prior,
we will move those business interests into the trust, get our income tax deduction, trust sells, no income taxes are paid. And then as that annuity comes to you, if it's a charitable remainder trust and that annuity is coming to you, you will pay some income taxes as that annuity is coming to you, but you're getting this huge deferral. So instead of having to pay a giant tax bill up front, you're able to defer, which allows those dollars to grow more and more and more, sort of in a tax-free manner inside this trust, which ends up benefiting, again, the charity down the road. And it's just sort of the opposite when you're looking at a charitable lead trust. So they're really, really powerful tools for those that have highly appreciating assets, or highly appreciated business interests, and you can get them in there prior to them selling.
That's so important. And I think there's so many business owners that are not aware. Actually, I know, because we have these conversations all the time, right, where they're in the process of considering a transaction. Sometimes we get there too late, where we're not able to help them, have that tax benefit. But if we are able to help in time, and they're able to move these assets or this business interest into that charitable remainder trust or charitable lead trust, then there's a lot of benefits in maximizing what they're getting out of the business and kind of spreading out that tax impact versus being all at once. So huge benefit. But key, yes, is for it to be prior to the sale. Another one that we see frequently is concentrated stock positioning, right? And so if they have those concentrated stocks, if, like, for example, if all you own is Pepsi and there's this high appreciation on them, they're low basis, that's another asset that you can, put into one of these trusts, benefit from, and not have to realize all of the gains immediately. So another strategy that we use with clients as well. I don't know if you have any other thoughts, Rick, on CRTs or CLTs?
I'd say just adding one more CGAs,
Okay.
charitable gift annuities. So charitable gift annuities, I think of as the sister or the brother to the CRT. So the charitable gift annuities more set it up with the charity or set it up with a charitable entity. You get a fixed stream of income every quarter for the rest of your life for one or two people. Put similar assets in that you would put into a CRT or a CLT, and people like it because you can know right down to the penny what the tax deduction is going to be on the contribution, and you know right down to the penny how it's going to be taxed on the other side. Is it going to have ordinary income tax, or is it going to be a return of principal, is in tax free, or is it going to be some capital gains taxes? But people love it because it's just laid right out there, right to the dollar. And so that's nice. So I'd say I often present CGAs, CRTs as income streams, as Chris said, now, and then the CLT for the idea of, well, let's move it out of the estate or let's do something different, but you can give the charity the income stream now. So I'd say those three, and maybe one more. Sometimes people can put inside of a charitable remainder trust, they can make it an annuity trust, right? So you can have the benefits of like what a charitable gift annuity offers, except you can put it into a trust, which means you can have it pay out for only a set period of time. Maybe you want to set up a CRAT, charitable remainder annuity trust, for 10 years, where you can't do that with a charitable gift annuity. It has to be lifetime. So back to folks, what do you want to do? What are you trying to accomplish? You can say, well, we got the CGA, the CRT, we got the CRUT, the charitable remainder unit trust, we got the charitable remainder annuity trust, we got the charitable lead trust. You just have to find out what it is that they want, and then you can go down the right road for which vehicle makes the most sense.
Yeah, totally. I was trying to avoid going down the acronym route there, but to your point, and the point you made prior, that's why it's important to work with professionals who understand the entire marketplace of how to give and give effectively for what you're trying to accomplish. And by the way, charitable gift annuities I like as well. It's always fun to be able to tell somebody, yeah, the charity is going to pay you actually. Like, what a fun thing to say. That's kind of reversing the roles a little bit for most people. And they go, wait, what did you just say? I'm like, yeah, it can work.
And to the point
Right.
of using qualified advisors, we actually just came across this week a client we just started working with, but a few years ago, he was advised to set up a charitable remainder annuity trust with a big amount of assets that had come into, his portfolio for selling a business. But what he didn't realize was that it was set for a specific period of time. After that time, the rest was going to go to annuity. And there's really nothing left for his wife. So, and he's significantly older than her by about 20 years. So he's already in his 80s, she's in her 60s. She will likely outlive him. And now the concern is there's so much that was put in there. They have other assets, but is it going to be enough to survive, to provide for her lifetime? Because he just wasn't advised properly. So that's kind of a bad side of the scenario, but not knowing how to do it right is so so detrimental in a situation like that. So I'm sure you've seen stuff like that too, Rick.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, exactly. I think it starts with these conversations with when we're sitting down in front of them where we have their best interests at heart. We're trying to think of the whole picture. We're trying to look at everything. And then we listen to them, and then we walk them to the solution, but we don't lead with a product or an idea because that just doesn't feel right. And to your point about past history, I mean, they're going to have situations where you're going to come in and say, I'm going to do my best to try to repair this, but I don't know how much I can do. I'm going to do this, but here's the bigger issue. And then you kind of feel bad for those people because you kind of feel like, well, if I had been in front of those people back then, maybe we wouldn't have this problem right now that they're dealing with. But I wasn't there. I'm here now, and let's just see what we can do for you today. So it's an absolute trust building exercise, which is I care about your situation, and I'm technically adept to be able to choose the right thing for you according to what it is that I think you're going to need at this time.
And the things you don't even know you need sometimes, right? Like income for your spouse in the future. So things like that. So Chris, moving on to one other thing that we talk about a lot, kind of near and dear to our heart, is life insurance. It's a giving vehicle that frequently goes unnoticed. People just don't think about it from like a charitable perspective. Can you explain how life insurance fits into charitable planning and some of the advantages of using it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's actually a few ways, just like we've been talking about with the other types of structures that can be utilized. There's a litany of ways that that they can be used. And again, it comes down to personal circumstances and what they have or what they're trying to accomplish, right? So, and Celeste, I love your thoughts on this as well, because I know you actually do a lot in this space. So, I think that we see a lot of families who have insurance policies that they no longer need. And so a lot of times those policies has value. And so instead of maybe letting the policies lapse or whatever they're, maybe just surrendering them, a lot of times, again, because those policies have value, you can donate those to a charity. You can still get an income tax deduction for them because it is an asset that has a value. And now the charity has an insurance policy that has a death benefit, or in some cases maybe a cash value that they can utilize. So it can be really powerful to take an asset that maybe you no longer need and you're just giving it to somebody who can actually use that. From a planning perspective, it's kind of cool because a lot of times we'll work with the charities on those situations too. So if somebody wants to give a life insurance policy, it's not uncommon for us to kind of go through and help them restructure it, because I would say that most charities aren't, whenever they get those, they don't necessarily want to continue to make premium payments on them. But again, working with a group like ours, we can help restructure those often and make sure that it's fitting the actual goals of the charity as well as the donor. We also have situations where you have charities who are accustomed to receiving annual donations from families on a very regular basis. And so they kind of build that into their annual cash flows. And so if that's kind of embedded in that charity's annual cash flows, the loss of that person and the loss of that donation can have, in some instances, a pretty substantial impact on what those cash flows are going to be in the future. So sometimes we'll see charities take out insurance policies on significant donors to help protect that loss of income. For those business owners, you can kind of think about it being key person insurance in a way. If this person is contributing a lot to this cause, specifically through this organization, we do see some charities that they look to do that as well. And then you have families who just really want to give large endowments at the end of the day. So we'll see sometimes where families will go, yeah, you know what, when I pass, I want my name on that building. Well, sometimes one way to do that is to buy an insurance policy and have that death benefit paid out to the charity. That's not necessarily uncommon too. What is more common though, and this kind of goes back to the point you were making a minute ago, Celeste, where all of a sudden the wife didn't have any money. Sometimes we'll set up what we call wealth replacement trusts. So whenever you're looking at a client who's looking at giving away a lot of their wealth or a substantial part of their wealth to a cause, sometimes they'll buy an insurance policy in a completely separate trust to offset that donation. So now you ensure that your heirs, your kids, or whoever you want to benefit outside of the charity with your wealth are sort of made whole for any amount, or to the extent that you want anyway, enough cash to help offset that donation. And so in your example, it could be that maybe those are business interests or the real estate, or there's something that has to be managed and the spouse isn't capable of doing that. Well, sometimes you might just want to give that away, have an insurance policy come in, and now spouse, kids have cash they can run their lives and they don't have to worry about the stress of running a business or things like that. So those are a few ways off the top of my head anyway that life insurance can be used in a charitable manner.
Yeah, and so we work locally with some national nonprofits that use this very regularly. And they use it for a couple of different reasons. They've used it for capital campaigns where they're trying to raise significant amount of assets. They know that the death benefit, in the policies isn't going to pay out immediately, but unfortunately we say, people don't die in order. So we've had many situations in which there was a premature death, and then there's this influx of death benefit that comes into the nonprofit. We definitely advise on how to ensure the properties are structured right to make sure that the nonprofit's benefiting, that the donor's getting the most benefit out of it. So there is, there's a science behind doing it, but the other reason they've done it is to engage next generation. So we'll have grandparents that buy life insurance policies on grandchildren to get them to be engaged with these nonprofits. So there's just lots of different ways, lots of different reasons that it's used. But it is one of those tools that's very much goes unnoticed and people don't know about. Even nonprofits, a lot of them don't even think about life insurance as a tool. What I like to tell them is think about it as kind of that future influx of cash that's going to keep the nonprofit going. It's going to give you guys some longevity within your organization because there are those influx of cash that come in as those death benefits pay out. So it provides some longevity to nonprofits as well. So Rick, we touched on this before too, but I think it's important to expand on it because it's a question we get a lot, private foundations. So I know we talked about it a little bit, but What are the pros and cons of? Could explain what a private foundation is. I think you've done a little bit further on that, and pros and cons of setting up these foundations and who they really are best suited for.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So, for context setting for the audience, there's $1.5 trillion in private foundations right now. So, we talked about 250 billion in DAFs, but 1.5 trillion in private foundations. So, obviously, they've been around a while and people have put a lot of money into these things. But who are they for? They're for the person who says, honestly, the donor advised fund may or may not be right for me. I'm not sure that they've always done the comparative model of one against the other, but really, I think they come into it saying, okay, I've made some money. I'd like to do something positive with it, charitably inclined here. Maybe we have a directive, maybe we have a certain focus that our family wants to have in the community. Maybe our egos here are, blossoming here, and we just want to showcase ourselves a little bit and show that we've arrived. But the idea that you can, unlike a DAF, you maybe want to hire some family members, or maybe you want to have a certain area of focus that makes sense. Now, there are some downsides to a private foundation too. They have taxes associated with them, like excise taxes that aren't necessarily associated with a DAF. The charitable tax deduction that you're able to take against a DAF is not always as attractive if you're using cash assets or non-cash assets. You have to hire a team really to make this happen. If you're going to go out and do this work that we've been talking about, which is making an impact in the world, how are you going to do that? Who's going to help advise you on where you should allocate these dollars? What are the fees going to be? Maybe you have to hire and curate your own portfolios. So there's a lot of heavy lifting, I think, associated with a private foundation that people don't necessarily think about, both in time and in money. And so that's why I always go back to, well, let's look at some of these other options: checkbook giving, commercial DAF, community foundation, private foundation, and see if what you want or what you think you want makes sense. Maybe one last point about private foundations is I used to think of them as, if you have about $10 million, you probably want to be thinking about a private foundation, at least as a consideration. But you can set up a private foundation for as low as $500,000. And I've seen private foundations set up for less than that. The question is it cost effective for you? Does it make sense for you? Are you going to have an influx of a lot of other money into it in the future, or not? And actually, maybe one very last thing I'll say about private foundations is, even though they have that mandated 5% that you must pay out, which is actually a burden for some people, they're not ready, ironically, to make that 5% distribution, because they say, well, I don't know what I'm going to give to, which kind of goes back to the things I just talked about, which is I don't think they've done their homework to be ready to make that distribution of 5%. But on average, private foundations only pay out around 6%, which is ironic, right? We said the DAFs have no minimum payout, but they pay over 20%. Private foundations have a mandatory 5% they must pay out, but they only pay just over 6%. And the dirty little secret is sometimes people with private foundations will take their 5% and put it into their donor advised fund because they still don't know what they want to do with it, which is kind of not really what you're supposed to do. It's just kind of delaying the what you're supposed to do, which is to distribute this money out into the community. So anyway, private foundations have their place, but it really should be in consideration with all the pros and cons, and really looking at private foundation against the other options that are out there.
That's the theme, right? Don't just let whatever your friend told you while you were playing tennis or something direct your charitable plan, because it just really, we say this all the time, but it depends on so many different factors and taxes and the management, the fees of some of these structures ongoing. There's so many different. Is your family really going to be involved? Many times I see these private foundations created because older generations want to involve younger generations, and some of the younger generations don't want to be involved. So, you have to look at the reality of the situation. Chris, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, no, it's a conundrum, right? Because you're right. Some people don't realize all the reporting obligations that you're going to have, and again, the ongoing expense, both accounting and time, really just running the foundation, much less giving. And then on the, when it comes to bringing family members in, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Peck, but Rick, I'm pretty sure that you can have a successor help manage DAFs too, right? So there are different ways to sort of accommodate those same needs. So again, going all the way back to the beginning, it sort of depends on your circumstances of what you're trying to accomplish to figure out which one of these things go, because they can be wildly flexible, again, depending on what you're trying to accomplish.
Yep.
That's right. You can name a successor donor advised fund advisor for the family if you want to, and that's very commonly done. In fact, very much encouraged. However, there are families that don't want to be involved, and so those conversations happen with the families to say, even though we have the staff and it's really cool, and you're going to be able to make grant recommendations and carry on your family's legacy, the kids might say, I'm sorry, it's just not for me. You say, okay, well, that's fine. Thank you for letting us know. And then we'll terminate the staff maybe at the passing of the first or the second spouse. So it's just really those conversations that need to happen around it, as you say, Chris. Otherwise, there's this misconception that people want to be more involved than they do, and now you've created something that's really a lot of work. That maybe the context around why we did this, what our legacy is, what it means to pass the baton from one generation to another as far as the focus of this private foundation. I mean, there's a lot of conversations that need to happen before we sort of just dump this responsibility onto future generations.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's actually one of the things we talk about a lot as well as, and we can go down this topic on another time. But just preparing the next generation and having those conversations with them, because if you set one of these structures up and then you don't tell anybody like the what, the why, the how, and if you really, I'm going to involve my kids, but you don't until you're 90 years old and like, oh yeah, by the way, we're doing this. It doesn't work, right? So yeah, you've got to start that communication early, which we advocate. But anyway,
all the time,
right?
Yeah. Don't hide your wealth from your children, because it doesn't really ever work out the way they think it's gonna work out.
Totally.
I know there's so many different strategies in giving vehicles, but there's two more things I definitely want to touch on before we talk about some other considerations and things that we wanted to cover. But so Chris, IRA, so retirement accounts, right? We have so many clients that many years ago were fully funding, max funding their retirement accounts, maybe getting matching from employers. They have these big retirement portfolios. And now they are also successful elsewhere. So they don't really need to start taking distributions or to take, income from retirement accounts. And then there's issues like the required minimum distributions that they have to take. There's no more stretch IRA, right? So all of those factors come in. What are some ways that folks in that space that maybe don't need their entire retirement portfolio or accounts, or only need a portion of it, can leverage that for charitable giving?
Yeah, for sure. So most of those accounts come at ordinary income tax rates, right? So whenever you get a distribution from one of those retirement accounts, you're going to pay a good chunk of income tax on it. So what we'll see a lot of times with the families, whether it's RMD or otherwise, required minimum distributions or otherwise, is they'll get that and then they'll donate it immediately to a charity so that they're getting that immediate income tax offset. And it can accomplish a couple of things. One, you have to receive the money anyway, and if you don't need it, to your point, you might as well give it to a good cause, and again, get that tax deduction and sort of write it off. But the other part is, and sometimes we'll see this, is to help them not go into a higher tax bracket because of that distribution. So sometimes sort of strategically planning how you're going to receive those and whether you gift it or not can come down to whether or not you're jumping a bracket or not. Kind of an interesting thing to say, but it's true. And then on the 10-year rule, so whenever you pass away, whoever inherits some of those plans, they have to distribute everything in 10 years. So that doesn't allow for any kind of stretch, meaning, your kids can't, sort of stretch how long they're going to receive it for and really take full advantage of sort of income tax deferral that comes along with those. So we actually see instances where sometimes families will accelerate their distributions, give it to charity, and then use that whole idea of a wealth replacement trust to sort of offset what was given using life insurance. So now you have this bucket of money that you can't have control over and stretch because life insurance is of course income tax free when it's received, and you're still benefiting the charity and doing all your income tax planning too. So there's a few different things that we plan for with families with that. They have those issues.
Yeah, I can see in summary there, right? If you have an asset that you don't know what to do with, but there's some charitable intent, consider like what is the best way for me to leverage this and use it from a charitable perspective. And so, Rick, another thing we see quite a bit are nowadays, going back to the point of things change over time, are digital assets, right? But we have a lot of clients actually that have created these huge like Bitcoin portfolios. What are you seeing as far as how are nonprofits adapting to that type of donation, and how can it fit into like somebody's giving strategy?
So let me start by saying maybe boldly that I don't think a lot of nonprofits are adapting to those new strategies. They are not ready for cryptocurrency in the sense of, first of all, it starts with bias. They just don't like it. There's something icky about it. They say, oh, it's cryptocurrency, and they've heard horror stories or whatever it is. So I think they honestly come to the table with, I don't know if I like it, but I try to be the voice of reason sometimes. And I say, listen, cryptocurrency and digital assets are out there. Okay. People have them. They make a lot of money off of them sometimes, and they do want to be charitable. They feel great about the fact that they've made all this money, and they can actually do something positive with it. So why would you not, as a nonprofit, be positioned to accept it, or figure out, if you can't accept it, who you can partner with to accept it? And again, contextually for the audience, I just heard this statistic from 2018 till now, $2 billion has been donated to charity through cryptocurrency. So it's there, right? And it's not going away. I haven't heard anybody say that cryptocurrency is going away. So we have Ethereum, you have Bitcoin, of course, and there's a whole slew of other types of cryptocurrency. And just another side note, the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, as you might imagine, being in Silicon Valley, was forced in some ways to consider cryptocurrency, because the co-founder of Ripple, which is a type of cryptocurrency, came over to them and said, hey, I have Ripple, obviously, and I would like to donate it. So would you like to accept this? And then they were forced into that field, and then they got pretty good at it. They started to have this digital wallet and have 10 plus different types of cryptocurrency that have been donated. So they got pretty good at it. In fact, in 1 year, I remember they got $151 million in cryptocurrency 1 year, just at the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. So you can partner with groups like the Giving Block. They're very good at accepting cryptocurrency donations. There's another group called Endowment, ENDAO, Mint. So like DAO is being like the twist or the fun word in the middle, but Endowment and the Giving Block are masters at that. And Silicon Valley itself is really, really good at it. And usually it's only maybe a 2% or a 3% haircut that they take to then process it. So I really look at it back to, okay, nonprofits, if you know that you could get a really decent amount of money by having a third party process it for you, and why are you the net proceeds? Why would you not want to advertise for cryptocurrency? And that really, to me, is the overarching question. And again, strangely, a lot of these nonprofits will say, well, we'll take all these other assets, but not crypto. So anyway, I think it's just more of a commentary on acclimating nonprofits to the idea, acclimating donors to the idea. Some of them are still not clear because they're getting a negative message from the nonprofits. Well, maybe we're not supposed to donate crypto, because I don't see a lot of nonprofits advertising for crypto donations. So maybe it's a bad idea. So it just becomes this kind of downward spiral. So I really feel like it's just about highlighting and amplifying the organizations that are really comfortable taking in crypto, that know this backwards and forwards, and having those conversations with the nonprofits to say, you have a partner over here. You can do it, and make sure you let the donors know about it too. You know, we can all work on this together.
Yeah.
You know, what's interesting about that comment is that, you know, charities, you know, historically don't necessarily want real estate and things like that because they're hard to liquidate and they're hard to manage, right? And then if you take an asset like crypto, does it have a clear market? Well, generally, yes, there actually is a clear market for that. So is it manageable? Yeah, it's manageable. And two, can you liquidate it? Yeah, you can liquidate it pretty quick. So the idea that they sort of struggle with that concept is an interesting one.
Yeah, don't be Blockbuster, right? Evolve.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say 2 points on that, Chris. Like, one is that I've heard that liquidating crypto is actually faster than liquidating stock.
Yeah.
That's one thing. And then the other thing, I just think in general, it's just like, we're not holding the asset. I mean, that's the thing. Like, no matter what asset's being donated, I think there's this myth that somehow the nonprofit's holding it. Most of the time, the nonprofit's not holding it. They're turning it around and liquidating it. So cryptocurrency, real estate, closely held stock, publicly traded securities, you name it, they're trying to get rid of that thing at the right price as soon as possible. So they're not speculating most of the time. They're not holding it. So it's like, again, how is crypto different from these other asset categories?
I did hear at a meeting is nonprofits don't like timeshares, so don't give timeshares. Apparently they're a pain to manage and expensive and all the things.
Actually, that is one thing I agree with. That's the one asset I would say avoid at all costs, because when you look at timeshares and you look at how many years people have been trying to sell these things, it's literally 2 years, 3 years. So I would say that one is a hard no. That's one I would say don't put that in your gift acceptance policy.
There was an attorney that did a presentation on charitable planning, and she said, say no to timeshares. timeshares. No timeshares will be
Yeah.
taken here because it's just too
Uh,
much of a mess.
I agree with that 100%.
Yeah. So, Rick, kind of last question in this like charitable giving or vehicle space. We get even from our clients that are wealthy, but maybe they have a blue collar business. They don't even realize that they're wealthy, and all of a sudden they are, or haven't been generational wealthy. They will ask us like, what are the wealthy people doing? Like, what are the other wealthy people doing? Are there any other strategies that you frequently see folks using to yes maximize charitable impact, but also that really benefits something different than what we've already discussed? Anything else you're seeing out there?
Well, just to compartmentalize it all out, I mean, we've talked about the assets you can donate. So when you say, what are wealthy people doing? Wealthy people are usually looking at all of their assets and figuring out which ones make the most sense to donate. So I think you start there. Which asset are you considering? But then when it comes down to, okay, what do you want to donate to? We've talked about a lot of those things today already. There's the idea of charitable remainder trusts, charitable gift annuities, charitable lead trusts are underutilized, in my opinion, by the wealthy. I think that there's a lot more energy that could be put into that in ways that are not, whether it's taking the asset completely out of your estate or putting it temporarily out of your estate and coming back. I definitely don't think that's explored, especially in times with the lead trust when interest rates are really low. I think there's a very big gap in having those conversations when the times are perfect to set up a charitable lead trust. But I'd say on the more unusual side, I guess, or the more cutting edge side, I think of donating in almost like a continuum where on one extreme, let's just say we're not donating. We're making a lot of money and we're putting money out into the world in a non-philanthropic way. We're making the most money as possible, most money we can, and there's that. And then on the other extreme, it's a flat donation. It's a pure donation where you get potential charitable income tax deduction, and it is 100% donated, no control by the donor, it's out. But then there's this stuff in between that's interesting, which is you hear about recoverable grants, the idea that you could make a grant and you could actually get it back. And I heard a terrific story about that last week where people were saying not only did they get the grant back, but then they could take the same grant that they got back and give it to a different situation and make more impact there. So it's like return on investment and then back to let's invest it back into the world of charitable giving all over again. I talked to a gentleman this week about venture philanthropy. He said there's something there's a whole nut to crack there on, and he said it's very gray, but it's something that a lot of wealthier individuals are looking at is like, what does venture philanthropy look like? And so on and so forth. So I think it's more, when I think about the continuum, it's like, how important is it to you to get a return on that or not? And if it is important, another option, for example, is you could invest in things that would be hyper-focused on a certain state, right? So maybe your rate of return isn't going to be as great as a worldwide diversified mutual fund type of portfolio. Maybe it's going to be that the rate of return on that's not going to be so good. It's going to be maybe 0 to 2%, but are you okay with that as a donor? And is that something you'd be interested in? So when you ask, what are cutting edge things? I think it comes back to there's a lot of really cool stuff out there. The question is, what's your risk tolerance as a donor? What are you looking for? What does impact mean to you? How much are you looking to give back to yourself in the form of tax savings or income or recoverable grants or what have you? And how much are you willing to just say, I don't want any of that. Like, I just want to put it out there and let the experts decide what to do with it. So long and short of it is there's a lot of really great things to explore. And I think that somebody should come into the conversation just really wide open and just listen and just see what resonates with you. What are the things that most resonate with you? And it's okay to say no. It's okay to say no to things that just don't resonate with you and just go down the road that seems to make the most sense for you.
Absolutely. Well, I know we might have to do a part 2 because there's so much more we wanted to cover, but I'm going to want to make sure we touch on 2 more things before we kind of wrap up and provide some last comments to our audience as well. But 2 key things, taxes and then involving family. So Chris, maybe if you can touch a bit on what are some of the tax considerations the donors need to keep in mind, both good and bad, right? We've talked about the benefit of it, but there's also tax implications that sometimes are not thought of or seen. What are some of the things that donors need to keep in mind from a tax perspective?
Yeah, I think that So sometimes it's just not understanding that, especially if you're doing like a charitable remainder trust, that there still will be income taxes that are due to you as that deferral, that annuity starts coming into you. So some of it, to me, a lot of it just kind of comes down to education and just making sure they're really set up to understand what is happening immediately, income tax deductions immediately, and then long term what that actually means. One, from a tax perspective, but also from a control and what you're going to get in the long term, right? So these are all charitable structures. You're going to give something away. And so you have to be somewhat comfortable that this is actually a thing. I'm actually giving this away. And what I'm going to get back might be limited. So I think that those would be the things. It's just, again, it just comes back to education and having the right people around you helping you make the right decision for the right circumstance, because there are a lot of options and they do all have different tax implications and control implications and long-term implications to you and your family and the charities that you're giving to. So I don't know, I guess it was a weird way to answer it, but I think it's just general education, so making sure you're going into these things eyes wide open.
And reporting, right? Having the right advisors to make sure that you're submitting the right tax returns and in the right form for the right things, so that you can get the right benefit from it.
And Rick, you mentioned the gray area. Well, there's an area that's not so gray either that we could probably have a whole nother session on. And that is, sometimes people will come out there and come up with these crazy structures that literally don't work, or they shouldn't work, but they're still put out there. And so again, just making sure that you're getting those types of structures vetted is important too, because sometimes you might get into something that seems great on the surface, and then when you dive into it, you may have broken 2, 3, 4 laws and didn't realize it because you just weren't advised properly.
But the IRS will know.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the team, Chris. When you have more than one set of eyeballs with more than one set of expertise looking at something, it says, let's kick the tires on this thing all the way around, rather than have one person come in and sell it hard to a donor. And the donor's like, it seemed to make sense. I didn't really understand it, but it seemed to make sense. And then you bring it over to the other advisors, and the other advisors go, yep, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. So be careful, and let's look at this a little bit more closely. Maybe it's legit. Maybe it is, but at least you have 4 other advisors looking at it, rather than just going down the road and then later coming to the advisors and going, I think I made a mistake. I probably shouldn't have done this, and now we can't undo it. Mm-hmm. And then you just sit all looking at each other like, yep, we probably should have had this discussion before you jumped in the water.
Yep.
Don't worry, the IRS will come help fix it.
Yeah. But they're like, but my favorite nephew told me it was going to be great.
Yeah, it's true. People are innocently doing what they think is the right thing to do, but they're not getting good, solid advice from professionals.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's why, just like you, Rick, we're widely collaborative when it comes to those types of things. I mean, we see a lot out there. You see a lot out there, and sometimes, like you said, getting the meeting of the minds together and really honing in on what something is seeing or out there in the wild, or if they're just coming to it for advice, having that collaborative approach, getting everybody, the attorneys, the CPAs, the wealth managers, the philanthropy, everybody rowing in the same direction. That's where the magic happens for families. And that's where, again, everybody goes into things eyes wide open, because, again, that advice has been put out there, and there's agreement, not just on the person who is maybe proposing it.
Talking, about family, the good, the bad, and the ugly of it all, right? But we've talked about family being involved in philanthropy, and we've seen times where it just didn't work. It wasn't thoughtful. There were too many controls. But Rick, in your experience, kind of to wrap up our conversation, because you do want to make sure that whatever you're doing isn't hurting anybody else, and that if philanthropy is important to you and you want for the next generation to be involved, that you're doing it the right way. So what are some of the effective ways you've seen of involving family and younger generations, even future generations, in your philanthropy planning?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start with what isn't effective, and that's to make it as punishment. I know that sounds weird, but I've heard stories where the family members are not involved in the business, and so the patriarch or the matriarch says, you know what, we're going to have little Johnny go over and set up a private foundation or something and have him manage that. And then Johnny goes, well, what am I, chopped liver? Why am I just managing the private foundation? Like, why am I not involved in the business? So there is that. And that does linger out there, and that's a dangerous road. So let's just start with that. I would also say that the idea that the matriarch or the patriarch sets up that private foundation or has somebody else set it up, and then they say, okay, we're going to make grants this way. This is how we're going to do it. So it's basically the opposite of involving your family members. It's being very directive. I've even heard a story where a grandfather told a granddaughter, your idea is stupid. That's a dumb idea. We should do it my way. My way is the right way. Your way is the wrong way. So I think the right way to go about engaging family is to make it so that it doesn't feel, first of all, mandatory. Because when it feels mandatory or obligatory, family members already start to shut down and say, I'm not into this. So if you allow the door to kind of swing open and, people come and go, that just makes it a little bit more friendly. And also respecting, this is, I think, a really important point, in respecting the family identity, the idea that as a family, maybe we share these values, and that's something that can carry on generation to generation. And also we respect individuality. Going back to the granddaughter, maybe the granddaughter and the grandfather share this, or the whole family shares this particular set of values like integrity and loyalty and maybe spirituality, but maybe there are other things that aren't necessarily shared. But it should be like this. It's okay for the granddaughter to have a different point of view. What's wrong with that? If she decides that she wants to go down this road and do this as an experiment or whatever and come back, maybe the whole family can learn from that. Maybe the whole family can go, I thought that also was a dumb idea when you started to do it, but now I realize it's amazing. And we judged that prematurely. So I think it's just more about the idea of what are shared values, what are individual values, what does in perpetuity look like, what would impact look like 3 generations, 4 generations from now. Last thing I'll mention about it, I think, is I love it when you hear about families taking a whole week together. Mm-hmm. Just spending almost like a big family reunion is what it is. But then they have these family business meetings to say, let's circle back to our donor advised fund, our private foundation, whatever it is that we have. And let's talk about the impact that we made last year. Let's talk about the impact that we maybe like to make next year. And let's just share some stories around the table. Maybe we have some experts come in and speak about certain topics. And you make it so that it feels like a fun and exciting and exhilarating maybe experience to think that our family is actually making this impact in the world, both as a collective and as individuals. And then then we go have fun and just play golf and play tennis or go swimming together. So it becomes more of just a super positive integrative experience that can happen year after year after year as older people die and newer people are born. It still is this ethos of the family that perpetuates. And I think that's the way to do it.
A family once shared that's all true, and it's all great advice, because the successful families that we see are doing exactly that. Something that's always stuck with me that a family shared with me was that they always had the younger generation sit down with the older ones, and in these family meetings or retreats, whatever they were having, and the older generations would tell them the why of the business, the why they were donating to a certain organization. They never told them how to do it, because they knew the future generations were going to do things differently. But they said, here's why these are our values, why we have tried to instill this, why we've done what we've done. And I think that creates a foundation of, okay, well, I do, to your point, share the same values or similar ones, but now I want to do it this way, right? And so understanding that why is so important, especially as new generations come along. Well, this has all been, like I said, we could probably do another 2 sessions talking about charitable planning, because there's so much to it. In all that we do at Rob and Glenn, we always talk about how there's just not one flavor to anything. Estate planning, tax planning, and charitable planning is absolutely on that same boat, where there's so many variations and types and considerations. It comes down to engaging the right professionals, having the right advice, and ensuring that what you're doing really fits into that big picture that you have. So thank you both so much. This has been incredibly insightful, and I know our audience is really going to benefit.
Great. Well, thank you for having us. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you, Celeste. Appreciate it.
For our audience looking to dive deeper into this topic of charitable planning or to connect with Rick, we will include his contact information in our show notes, along with some other helpful resources. Join us in our next episode. With the holidays bringing together a lot of busy families, it presents a unique opportunity to have some of those important family conversations. many times around finances. So our guest is going to be sharing insights on how to make sure those conversations are productive and effective and don't just turn into heated debates. That is all for today, but if you enjoyed what we shared, please like, subscribe, and share our podcast. And as always, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Planning Reimagined, where your wealth journey meets our expert insights. We will see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and please be sure to follow on your favorite podcast player. To connect with us, you can email us at hello@robinglenn.com or schedule some time with us via the link in the show notes. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok at Hello Robin Glenn.